As if to prove that Canada was not the right place to make a low-budget horror film, the government's reaction to the appearance of Shivers was, it wasn't overt, but it was fairly extreme. It was in reaction to other people's reaction. It wasn't their own reaction, and I suppose in a way that's a bureaucratic kind of response. There was a famous article that Robert Fulford had written for Saturday Night magazine, which he was also the editor of. It was the cover story, or it was one of the cover stories, and it said, you should see the movie, I think it was called Parasite Murders at the time. You should know how bad this movie is, after all, you paid for it. And inside he said the most hideous things about the film. I had actually invited him to the screening because I thought he would like the film. He had written rather sweetly about my underground films, Stereo and Crimes of the Future. And I really thought he would understand how Shivers was an evolution of that sensibility, but he did not. He was quite repulsed. He said it was repulsive, and he might have said it was pornographic, I can't remember. He said very the kind of things that make a government very nervous when it's a film that the government has invested in. And that was the key, that the government launching its new film and television agency, I think it was just a film agency at the time, suddenly finds itself making a film labeled pornographic and repulsive by one of the country's leading film critics and a very respected journalist and writer. This was not good. And when I said to the then head of the CFDC, Michael Spencer, I said, you know, there are only 100 people who read Saturday Night magazine. He said, unfortunately, it's the wrong 100 people. And the result was that I got frozen out of the film fund for several years. My next film that I had written at John's urging, which was to become Rabid, was something that the CFDC did not want to be involved in. And when we began to work on the film, and it appeared that we were going to cast a porno star, Marilyn Chambers, as the lead role, that just confirmed for everyone what a mistake the government's investing in Shivers had been. On the other hand, it was pointed out that Shivers was the first, and at that time the only film that the government had invested in that had actually paid back its investment and actually made some money for the government. That wasn't talked about too much, but it was definitely something that had an impact on the agency itself. And so I think reluctantly, I must say, because I did feel that they were friendly to me, but they were under the public eye, and they were very worried, and they really did work with Cinepix to try to find a way to secretly invest in Rabid. There were attempts to cross-collateralize it with other films and sort of not mention Rabid, and there was a lot going on. The result was, though, that it took a couple of years before we could get funding for the film, because at that point, the CFDC was really a major player. I mean, for a low-budget film, if you didn't have money from them, there were not too many other places to go, and Cinepix really couldn't make it happen without them. So it was a difficult and painful birth for the next film that I was doing at the Cinepix School of Filmmaking, Rabid. And Rabid, also produced by Ivan Reitman, was a much bigger scale film. Instead of terrorizing one lonely high-rise apartment building, we were going to terrorize the entire city of Montreal and cause the military to be brought out to deal with the crisis. And it was a very difficult script to write, and at times I found myself with my girlfriend, who later became my wife and is still my wife, writing it at John's country place, going crazy, trying to plot the very intricate series of events, because there are many, many characters in the film, and many events happening simultaneously, and the arranging of all those is very critical. And John and Ivan were very, very helpful in helping me figure out how to do that. I'd never written anything as complex in a physical way, a narrative way, before. Why I ended up with a script that was so ambitious in terms of location shooting and military equipment and so on was simply because I, as a writer, don't think about what's going to be on screen other than what I want to be on screen. And in fact, that has continued. You can sort of sense when you're doing a movie that's going to be really expensive, but I try not to let the possible production influence the writing at all. At that point, it's all up for grabs. I mean, it's a wonderful fantasy, and you can do anything you want, and I think it's a mistake to try to suppress that. So I try not to self-censor when I write, even in terms of money and production. After that, you have to deal with the real world and see what you can do. But fortunately, the boys at Cinepix they loved a challenge, and they loved the idea of doing something huge for no money. This also was very Roger Corman-like of them. But there was a difference, and the difference, I think, was that John always appreciated quality and was very obsessed with detail and attention to detail. And this was one of the major lessons that I learned from him, was that the budget is not the only arbiter of quality. There's obsessiveness and work and the work ethic, and that has nothing to do with budget. It has to do with personalities and talent and spirit. And that was very important for me to learn. And they were not daunted by using the entire city of Montreal as their palette for this film. So we marched into it with great enthusiasm, and in fact, the optimism was justified, because there were many, many things that we did that were very funny and very amusing to me and very clever, and have stood me in great stead. Just simple things like using extras 2 and 3 times in different directions to double the number of extras that you have, and doing what's called a French reverse, where you shoot 2 ways, but you're really shooting the same way, but it seems for various reasons that you're shooting in different directions. Great economy. It was a great school, and has stood me in I've shot with budgets up to $20 million, and it still feels the same as shooting Shivers and Rabid, I mean, to me, in terms of the technique and the frugalness and the attempt to get the absolute most out of the time and money that you have. And so Rabid was my first epic. I had a moment during the pre-production, and I think I was still writing Rabid, a moment that is common, I think, to every writer, certainly, a crisis of confidence. I suddenly saw the film really cold, and I thought, this is a ridiculous premise. I mean, this film cannot work. It is the most ridiculous. I can't believe that we've all been running around getting very enthusiastic and serious about this, because of its subject matter, really, is ludicrous. It was sort of the emperor has no clothes moment. And John, in particular, had to talk me back down, you know, talk me off the ledge of the one that I was about to jump off. And amongst other things, he said, you know, you've got to do another film. You've done one. You've done one movie. You've done films, but this is Shivers was your first movie. You've got to do another one. You've got some momentum going. It's taken a couple of years. You've got to do it. If for no other reason, you have to do it. And then he also said, and I've got to tell you that this premise that you think is ridiculous, there's something about it that is really, really profound and really works. It's really heavy, and it's going to be great. And I accepted what he said, and before long I was back in self-hypnosis mode, which is what you have to do when you're making a film of extreme fantasy, the way Shivers and Rabid both were. If you stop believing in it yourself, then you cannot convince anybody else that it's real. And for that one moment, I'd stopped believing that Rabid was real. Finally, I got back into it, and I've never stopped believing since, you know, because it now has film reality, and that's a very strong reality. But at that moment, you're very vulnerable. The moment just before you make the film, you're very vulnerable to doubts and to complete collapse of the reality of what you're about to do. You know that you could walk away from it, and nothing would change. You know, nothing catastrophic would happen, except maybe to your career. But I mean, it's not necessary, and you have to get to a point where you feel that the film is necessary. And that was this moment that happened. This was the first time I think it happened to me, was with Rabid. Rabid was the movie, I think, where I gradually began to realize that I had power as well. Because with Shivers, because I knew so little, the schedule, the shooting schedule, and the budgeting for all the things that were budgeted came from somewhere else. They came from God. They came from John and Andre, basically, and Ivan as well. They were delivered to me. This is what you're going to shoot today, and this is what you're going to shoot tomorrow. I gradually realized that I could be more effective and more efficient if I was involved in the process of scheduling and budgeting and hiring even the lesser members of the crew, which was something that I had not really been much involved with in Shivers, although I was completely involved in the hiring of actors, but not in many of the other people, because I didn't even know, as I said, I didn't even know what they did, so how could I judge whether they were people I should work with? When it came to Rabid, I had a lot more input into the structure of the shoot. And I was beginning to realize what my own rhythms were, how I like to shoot, what I like to spend time on and what I felt I didn't need a lot of time on. And because these things are different for each director, at that point, what Ivan's experience was and what anybody else's experience was could not really help me. And so I became much more assured in terms of knowing where a director's power could go. And I don't mean this in an ego way, I just mean it simply in what you control and what you leave, what you delegate to people and what you don't delegate to people. And of course, having gone through the entire process of making a film once, you now know so much more than you could ever possibly have imagined. On every level, and very subtle levels as well as very crude levels. And so it certainly shows, I think, in the film Rabid. Although I was doing many things that I had not done before, but what you begin to learn is that there are always absolutely new things. Every film is an experiment, because you're always going to be doing things that you have not done before. The chemistry on the set will always be different. There will always be many different people there. And so you realize that you can't just, or in fact I would be bored to suddenly find myself saying, oh yes, this is all totally familiar, I have no problem. That would be deadening. So that mixture of the familiar and the confidence and yet the terror and the excitement of the new were mixed very well in Rabid. And it was a better mix, of course, than in Shivers. Although, of course, in some ways, maybe Shivers was a more uniquely original concept. It's hard to say. It's hard for me to say at this distance. I'd seen what I thought was my leading lady in Sissy Spacek, and I ended up with Marilyn Chambers. It seems like a big leap. John actually didn't like Sissy's accent. She had a Texas accent, I think it was Texas, and he just didn't see her in the role at all. By the time we were shooting Rabid, Carrie had come out, and suddenly Sissy Spacek was a huge horror film star, and of course it would have been a huge coup for us to have had her in our film. And I believe that you can see a poster for Carrie in Rabid as if somebody walks past a theater. But it didn't work out, and it was Ivan's idea to look at Marilyn Chambers, who was unusual as a porno star because she played it like the girl next door, you know, the blonde, beautiful, sweet girl next door, who in fact was the Ivory Snow girl and had appeared on boxes of Ivory Snow, whose motto was 99 and 44/100% pure, which Marilyn definitely wasn't. She had made a very, very famous porno film called Behind the Green Door, which I still haven't seen. And she showed up with her boyfriend, no, he was at that time her husband and her manager, who was rather notorious and kind of a Las Vegas kind of guy, who was on the set all the time. And I seem to think he was carrying a gun. I know that he was very much into guns, and this was at a time when no one in Canada was into guns, especially handguns. So this was a very strange situation for me, but very exciting because of the size of the production. With Rabid, I began to realize that politics and the art of filmmaking don't belong together. Here we had a film with a woman character who was the lead character, who was quite strong, quite aggressive, and I think quite sympathetic, and in fact quite well played by Marilyn Chambers. She really did want a legit film career, and I really thought that she would have been capable of it. Her performance is really not bad, and it's her first one with a lot of dialogue and so on. And I thought she was really quite good, and I have no idea why that didn't work out for her. But and there's a very strong friendship between two women that is at the core of the film as well. But people who want your film to be misogynistic will make it misogynistic no matter what. So although I did get some credit for having a woman who was a lead character in a horror film, and once again this was happening at about the same time as Carrie, there were criticisms. She was considered, the lead character was predatory. You know, she was vicious. She attacked. She killed. She did bad things. And so, even though I think it's obvious that she's sympathetic and that she's in the control of forces that are not her own, there's good politics to be made of Rabid as well, if you want to. Of course, later the film was seen very much as an AIDS metaphor and various contagious disease metaphors. And of course, this was one of the unique things about both films, was the inner horror being the inside being the source of horror, as opposed to something outside. And this was relatively unique in filmmaking at the time. It has become a very common theme at this point. But at the time it was very unique. Both Shivers and Rabid, the spread of horror through something as realistic as disease, as opposed to something quite supernatural. This was quite unique for both films. And once again, I think politically then, viewed from that point of view, they seem to be quite in advance of their time. So it really depends. I mean, you can see the politics shifting with the rise and fall of various wings of various political movements. And when Shivers and Rabid are considered at all, which in fact they often are, there was a very, the fortunes of the film rise and fall, and you realize once again, I think, as a filmmaker, that you have to abstract yourself from that kind of thinking when you're making a film. There was not technically political correctness at the time, but there were the beginnings of it. There was a film critic named Robin Wood, who had written a book on Hitchcock and so on, who really saw the films, both Shivers and Rabid, as metaphors for encouraging the suppression of anything but conformity. He saw them as films that were pro-conformity, which I find really very strange. And we had many debates in public at times about this, because I felt, in fact, that the films were quite subversive. And in fact, I feel that most horror films are subversive of the status quo, because they do have a very strong appeal to the unconscious. And I do, in the Freudian formula, civilization is repression of unconscious desires and forces. And so that anything that appeals to the conscious, i.e. art, is automatically subversive of civilization on a certain level. So these are the things you start to think about And this is something that these two relatively low-budget horror films started a lot of critics thinking about and writing about in terms of horror films in general. And so I think the two films have quite a noble place in the history of film criticism, ultimately.